Have any of you ever been to Alaska? Anybody? I've been to Alaska. It's a really beautiful place to be. Now, I went in the summer, so I'm sure it's a lot different in the winter. But there's a town in Alaska. It is the northernmost town in the United States. It is Barrow, Alaska. And something very unique happens in Barrow, Alaska. The sun sets November 18th, and it doesn't come up until January 23rd. Could you imagine that? Now, that doesn't mean it's pitch black all the time. They have a few hours of twilight every day, but the sun actually doesn't come up over the horizon. Altogether, that is about 66 days without sunlight. Now, I don't know about you, but I think I would be very depressed if I had to endure 66 days without the sun. Sunlight gives us energy. Being out in the sun helps our health. It helps us feel good. It helps our emotional health. But darkness can be so heavy. Even here in Iowa, winter can bring on seasonal depression because we're stuck indoors. We aren't getting the light from the sun, and it can really impact people's health and their mental health. Now, 66 days in darkness or 66 days without the sun, I'm sure would have a huge impact on us. But could you imagine centuries of darkness? Could you imagine a life lived in darkness without sun? Could you imagine what that would be like? Although we might not physically live in darkness, Scripture speaks of darkness and how mankind, people, sometimes even nations, it describes them as living or walking in darkness. When we look at that, one of the things that we see about the prophecies in the Old Testament about the coming Messiah, one of the things we see is the picture of light and how the Messiah, the chosen one, the one who would come to fulfill the promises that God had made to his people, one of the pictures, one of the figures that are used to describe the coming of the Messiah is the idea of light. And so today, as we continue our series this Christmas on Christmas from the prophets, remember last week we looked at Micah and saw how the Messiah would come from Bethlehem and the Messiah would be king. He would come to rule, and he would also come as the shepherd of God's people. Today we are going to be in Isaiah chapter 9. And we're going to break this passage up into two sections because there's just so much in this Isaiah passage that speaks about the coming of the King, the coming of the Messiah. And today's message is titled A Great Light, because in this passage we will see that the coming of the Messiah is described as a great light appearing to those who live in darkness. So let's look at Isaiah chapter 9. Like I said, this particular passage we're breaking up into two sections. Next week we'll look at verses 6 and on, which is a very well-known passage that describes the Messiah as a king, as the everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace. We all know that passage. We'll look at that next week. But today we're going to look at the verses that lead up to that point. So let's look at Isaiah chapter 9, starting in verse 1. It says, "But there will be no gloom for her who was in anguish. In the former time, he brought contempt into the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali. But in the later times, he has made glorious the way of the sea, the land beyond Jordan, Galilee of the nations." Now, before we get any further, there is a lot that's packed into this verse, and a lot that we probably don't immediately understand as people who don't live in Israel, especially during this time. So, first of all, we can see from the very beginning, we see that something is going to happen that is going to change the fortune of God's people. It describes in the verse sentence, there will be no more gloom for those who are in anguish. Well, this tells us a lot of things. First of all, it tells us that God's people are now in anguish. God's people, when Isaiah wrote this, were suffering. There was gloom, there was despair. And the reason for that is God's judgment. We know that when Isaiah was written, the northern kingdom of Israel had been taken captive and scattered throughout the kingdom of Assyria. Assyria came down and defeated the northern kingdom of Israel. When Isaiah was writing, they were looking forward to Babylon coming and judging God's people because of their sin. And so you could imagine living in this place where the northern kingdom, your brothers, your people have been defeated. And as you look to the future, there is this feeling of despair as Babylon is getting stronger and getting closer and is gaining influence. And you know that there's no hope. Israel, there's no hope for Judah when a powerful nation like Babylon is coming. So when Isaiah wrote this, the land of Israel, God's people, were in anguish. God's people were in despair. But Isaiah is saying something is going to happen that is going to turn all that around. People who are in anguish, there will be no more gloom. God is going to do something that is going to take away the despair. God is going to do something that will take away the anguish of his people. God is going to do something that will change everything. Now, in the rest of the verse, he describes a few things that I think it's helpful for us to understand. He says, in the former time, he brought into contempt the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali. Now, these are two different tribes of Israel, and they are representative of the northern tribe of Israel, northern kingdom of Israel. So when he speaks of these two tribes, he's using them to describe that northern kingdom. And what he's describing here is how the northern kingdom fell to the hands of the Assyrians. It happened around 734 to 733 BC. And the king, the emperor of Assyria came and took Israel's territory. They took Israel and turned that land into a place where it was now full of Gentiles. The people were taken and scattered and then resettled by people who were not Jewish. So now the land that once was held by God's people, that had been promised to God's people, was now full of Gentiles and pagans. And we know in the New Testament that there were a few Jews who were left behind, and they started intermarrying with these people. And eventually this people becomes the Samaritans that we see in the New Testament. So when Isaiah was writing this, he's looking at Zebulun, he's looking at Naphtali, he's looking at the northern kingdom, and the people of Israel look at it with contempt because it has been defiled by pagans. They have turned the land of Israel, the land of promise, into a place that is full of paganism and idolatry, and they look at it with sadness. They look at it with disgust. And Isaiah is saying, this place that is now a place of contempt, God is going to do something that's going to take away the contempt that was associated with this. So far we see God is going to take away the gloom. God is going to take away the anguish. God is going to take away the contempt. God is going to do something miraculous and amazing. It goes on in verse 1, but in the latter time, he has made glorious the way of the sea, the land beyond Jordan, Galilee of the nations. The way of the sea was the main road that led throughout the northern kingdom of Israel. The way of the sea was the path that the Assyrian emperor took to come in to conquer God's people. And if you would think of that, the path that the conquering empire came down to destroy the nation, to ruin the nation, that would not be a place that God's people would look at with joy. That would always remind them of their sadness. The way of the sea was associated with defeat, with oppression, because that's the way the Assyrians came. It also talks about Galilee of the nations, which is probably something you haven't really heard before. When you think of Galilee, what do you think of? Sea of Galilee, Jesus? That's where Jesus was from, right? During Isaiah's time, they called Galilee Galilee of the nations, or Galilee of the Gentiles, because the Gentiles had moved in and taken control, and this was a name that they used, a name that was that showed Israel's disgust that Gentiles now occupied God's promised land to Israel. And so Isaiah is saying, where there is now gloom, that will be taken away. Where there is anguish, that will disappear. Where there is contempt, God is going to turn contempt into glory. And He's going to do it through some very specific places. Naphtali, Zebulun, the way of the sea, Galilee. God was telling His people, this place that you now view with contempt, God is going to make glorious. That's a pretty amazing thing. And we're going to see as we look throughout this passage, as we look throughout this and study it, that these places are very important in the life of the Messiah. These places are very significant in the life of Jesus. And it's not by accident. It is to fulfill. We even see in Matthew. Matthew points to this passage in showing that Jesus in His ministry fulfills these words. That Jesus is the one who turns gloom and anguish into joy. Jesus is the one who turns the land that was full of contempt into a glorious place. Jesus is the one who fulfills these promises. And as we look then in verse 2, we continue on with this prophecy of the one who is to come. And it says in verse 2, the people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Those who dwelt in a land of deep darkness, on them has light shone. And as we look at this passage, I think there's something that's really important and significant for us to understand about the prophecy of the Messiah that was fulfilled in Jesus, that was fulfilled in Jesus Christ. We see, first of all, point number 1, Isaiah 9 tells us the Messiah brings light. The Messiah brings light. We see already the picture of verse 1 is telling us that things aren't going well in Israel. Things aren't great in the land. And God's people are going through pain. They're going through suffering. They're going through times of darkness. And God is telling His people that there will be times of darkness. And that they will walk in darkness. And it is in that time of darkness where God is going to send a light. Now, when we think of this idea of darkness, the parallelism in verse 2 really emphasizes the idea that this is a really bad situation. Now, when we think of darkness, even for us, darkness is a time that's more dangerous than the light, right? Darkness is a time where even as adults, there can be more fear in darkness than in daytime. We think of people doing things in darkness. We think of crimes. We think of all of these kinds of things. But this type of darkness goes beyond just that. In the second part of verse 2, it says, those who dwelt in a land of deep darkness. What's really interesting about this description is that phrase, deep darkness, comes from one Hebrew word. And this Hebrew word is the same Hebrew word that's used in Psalm 23 that describes the shadow of death. Where it says, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. It describes how he leads us beside the still waters. He restores our souls. He leads us through the valley of the shadow of death, and we fear no evil, right? It's the same word. Now, of course, words can be just, interpreted or translated differently depending on their circumstances. But understand that's the same kind of concept that we're looking at here. In Psalm 23, it's the idea that they're walking through this dangerous, dangerous darkness. And here in Isaiah, I think it's talking about the same thing. That God's people are in a deep darkness. And when Jesus came, Israel was oppressed by the Romans. Israel had gone through centuries of struggle, centuries of oppression. After Assyrians came the Babylonians. After the Babylonians came the Persians. During the Persians, Israel was allowed to return to the land. But while they were in the land, they met with opposition. They were in danger. We see there was a time they were conquered by the Greeks. There was a little period of time where Israel rebelled and were able to defeat the Greeks and get them out of the land. But then the Romans came. It was just oppression after oppression. One empire after another oppressed Israel and kept them from the freedom that they longed for, that kept them from the prosperity that they hoped for, where they could not experience the fulfillment of God's promises. This had gone on for centuries. And there's a reason why there was this hope for a Messiah during Jesus' day. It was when we study what happens throughout Israel at that time, there were false Messiah after false Messiah that came to the forefront, that gathered followers because people needed hope. People were looking for deliverance. People were looking for God's promises to be fulfilled. There was great darkness. There was deep darkness. And in that place of darkness, God sent a light. And it wasn't just a little light. I love the description. It says that the people have seen a great light. That a light has shone upon those who are living in this deep darkness, who are living in the shadow of death. And what's really interesting is as we see this idea of light, as we see this idea that God is going to do something to turn around the fortune of his people, we see that picture of light described very clearly in Jesus. I already mentioned in Matthew chapter 4, verses 12 through 17, quotes these verses at the beginning of Jesus' ministry. In verse 12, he says, "And now we heard that John had been arrested, John the Baptist. He withdrew into Galilee. After leaving Nazareth, he went and lived in Capernaum by the sea, in the territory of Zebulun and Naphtali." These things sound familiar, don't they? And then he says in verse 14, "So that what was spoken by the prophet Isaiah might be fulfilled." And then he quotes the verses that we just read. Jesus went to Galilee, lived in Galilee. Jesus went by Capernaum, which was associated with the way of the sea. Jesus dwelt in the land of Zebulun and Naphtali so that these words would be fulfilled and God's promises would be completed in him. We also see in John chapter 1, verse 1, it says, "In the beginning was the Word." The Word is a picture that's used to describe Jesus. "And the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made." So far in these verses, we see some very powerful statements about Jesus. Jesus is God. Jesus is creator. Jesus is eternal. Verse 4, "In him was life, and the life was the light of man. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. If we skip down to verse 14, it says, "The Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory, glory of the one as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth." God promised in Isaiah that a great light would come from a land that is full of contempt, come from a very specific place, come from Galilee, come from the way of the sea. And Jesus fulfilled these things in his ministry. Jesus came to bring light. Light is a very important part of our lives, even though sometimes we probably take it for granted. Life is essential to life here on this earth. I read an article by Eva von Strine who talks about how light is the essence of life itself. And she says some things in this article that we probably know are true, but we don't really appreciate it many times. In the article, she talks about how light is the most valuable resource on the planet. Have you ever thought about that? Probably not. We just wake up and expect the sun to come up, right? We just expect it to be there. But she goes on to talk about without light, we wouldn't have life. Plants are the most abundant life on earth, right? They need light. And through the process of plants transforming light into energy, we see the photosynthesis. And with that, they produce oxygen, which we need for life, right? We know that as humans, being out in the sunlight gives us vitamin D, which is very important, very significant. But the truth is, without the light of the sun, Earth would be a dead, barren place. We all know about, we've studied in science class the second law of thermodynamics, how things decay, things get worse over time if left to themselves. But if energy is put into a system, that can reverse that idea of things decaying. Light, the energy from the sun, keeps the earth alive. It keeps life possible here on this place. And I think it's important for us to understand, even in our physical world, light is so vital to everything. That's true in our physical world. But it also has a much deeper spiritual truth too. Because although the sun is significant and important and vital for us to live, we know that Jesus, the Son of God, created the sun. We know that Jesus, the Son of God, just like light from the sun gives life on this earth, so the light of Jesus gives life to man. Not just physical life, but spiritual life. Life that is able to transform our gloom and anguish and shine in the darkness. The picture is that this Messiah will come and will be a light that shatters the darkness, will be a great light that dispels all of the gloom that comes from the shadows and comes from the darkness. And that's what Jesus does. Jesus is the light, and he gives life to everyone who trusts and believes in him. The promise of the coming Messiah is a promise of light coming to a dark world. And as we look and understand what God has in store for his people, the result of that light has some significant impact on God's people. And when we understand that this light that breaks, this great light that shines in the darkness, will change God's people. And so let's look at verse 3 and understand some of the things that will come as a result of the light coming into the world. Verse 3, you have multiplied the nation. Speaking of God here, when it's talking about you, it's saying God has multiplied the nation. You have increased its joy. They rejoice before you as with joy at the harvest, as they are glad when they divide the spoil. So as we look at this verse, what is one of the things that is the result of the light coming into the world? Well, it's joy, right? And that's point number 2. Not only does the Messiah bring light, but the Messiah brings joy to God's people. And as we understand what this is describing, we see that the joy is described in a few different ways. First of all, it tells us that you have multiplied the nation. And what this is describing is Israel, which when Isaiah wrote it was a small, not very powerful place. Even when Jesus was on the earth, Israel was a small, insignificant nation that lived under the thumb of the more powerful empires, whether it was the Greeks, the Romans, the Persians. They were small and insignificant. And God is promising that they will multiply, they will increase, they will get stronger. God wants his people to know that they are not abandoned, that they are not left, that he has not forgotten about them. But when that light comes, they will multiply. It implies that they will have strength. It implies that there will be prosperity. It implies that there will be peace. And we see that in the rest of the verse. It says, as they multiply, their joy will increase. So this isn't descriptive of a nation that's full of turmoil and warfare and battle and oppression. They are increasing and their joy is multiplying. It talks about them rejoicing, and it gives us some pictures of joy. It says that there will be the joy like the joy at the harvest. Now, I have to admit, I don't really understand this picture because I'm not a farmer. And I've never been a farmer. April grows a few things in the backyard, but that's about it. So I don't understand necessarily the joy that a farmer feels at the harvest, but maybe we can relate to it in some ways, right? But think about this. A farmer, we live in Iowa, so maybe some of you grew up on a farm. Maybe some of you have been farmers over time. You know, the harvest is not the result of, you just go throw the seeds and the next day you go and harvest. That's not how it works, right? It takes time. It takes patience. And for many farmers, their harvest has a great impact on everything in their lives, right? If there's a year where there's a bad harvest, that means there's less money. That means there's less to go around. And the same is true when there's a plentiful harvest, that there's abundance and there's prosperity. And like I said, I can't fully relate to this, but I think in some ways in all of our life, we can all relate to the idea of a hope and a security and the thankfulness that God provides. I think we can all relate to that. I know there have been a few times in my life where I've sensed the joy maybe similar. Many of you know I left my last church in Florida, and I had a few years away from ministry, and I was looking just for a regular job, and it took me a little while. It took me longer than I thought it would, and it was a struggle. And I remember when I finally was offered a job, it was at a furniture store selling furniture. Although later on I didn't really love it that much. When I got the job, I was so happy because, I'd gone all this time without working and we had bills to pay. And I had kids at home. And I was worried, how would I pay my bills? How would I care for my wife? How would I give the things to my kids that they need? But when I was offered that job, it was like this relief. Everything's going to be okay. It was an understanding that God had provided a means for me to care for my family. And even though it wasn't a job that I, dreamed of, I was filled with joy that God had provided. I can also say when I came here, I had the same feeling. It was 2 years in between ministry, and I was looking for a long time. And it was frustrating. And it was hard. And If things didn't work out here, I didn't know what we were going to do. We were planning on moving away from Florida, whether we came here or not. Our plan B was to sell our house in Florida and go live in my parents' basement for a little while until we could figure things out. And when God provided through you, there was joy and a peace. We're going to be okay. God is in control. It's been a long road. It's been difficult. But we know you're here, God, and we know you're going to take care of us. And as I look at this, that's what I was thinking about this week. The joy of God providing. Knowing that there is security. Knowing that you have enough. And I think whether we've ever farmed or not, we can understand the joy of the harvest. Of reaping the benefits of what God has blessed us with. The next picture is the picture of dividing the spoil. And once again, I've never been a soldier, and I've never divided spoil. But the idea is, in the ancient times, when one army was victorious, as they conquered places, as they conquered land, they would spoil that place. They would take all the valuable things. They would take livestock. And that would be divided among the soldiers. And we have that saying, to the victor goes the spoils, right? To divide the spoils means victory. It means victory. It means that God has given victory to his people. And I can only imagine what it would have been like at the end of World War II when it was finally over. You see pictures and watch some videos of just the reaction of people when they heard the war was finally over. And that's the type of joy that God is bringing to his people. The joy of victory, the joy of security, the joy of knowing that God has fulfilled his promises to his people. And it's really interesting that joy is associated a lot with the birth of Jesus. Remember what the angel says to the shepherds? Remember what the message is of God to his people. The message is God is fulfilling his promise. God is sending the Messiah. God is filling his people with joy because of Jesus. And so as we think of Christmas, as we go through this passage, think about the light that Jesus brings into the world. Think about the joy that Jesus has brought into the world and into our lives. And the final part of this, it kind of goes a little bit with what we just talked about. But let's look at verse 4 and 5. For the yoke of his burden and the staff for his shoulder, the rod of his oppressor, you have broken, as on the day of Midian. For every boot of the trampling warrior in battle tumult, and every garment rolled in blood, will be burned as fuel for the fire. The third point in this passage that we need to know is that not only does the Messiah bring light, not only does the Messiah bring joy, but the Messiah brings deliverance to his people. It uses another few illustrations to describe the deliverance that God brings. It first of all talks about the yoke of his burden. Yokes were wooden beams that were tied around animals' necks, right, for them to pull farming equipment so that they could plow fields. That's the yoke, the beam that goes around the neck. The staff. The staff is we often think of a shepherd's staff that's used to corral sheep, and also we see the rod of his oppressing. The idea is that Israel is under the yoke of oppression, under the yoke, we could think of slavery, that God is going to come and he's going to break the yoke. He's going to break the staff. He's going to break the rod. He is going to turn their enemies, turn their oppressors powerless. He's going to defeat them. And he says, you have broken as on the day of Midian. Now, this is speaking to Gideon. You remember the story of Gideon in the Old Testament? In Gideon's time, the Midianites were oppressing God's people. And it was really bad. You might remember Gideon was trying to thresh wheat in a well because he was scared. Because he knew that if they found out he was trying to divide the wheat, that they would come and take it away. And so an angel comes to Gideon and he says, God is calling you to lead God's people to defeat the Midianites. Remember that story where Gideon gathered a bunch of people, thousands of soldiers to him. And what did God say to Gideon? There's too many, right? Could you imagine being Gideon? First of all, knowing that what you have is probably not enough. And God saying, no, that's too many. And so, remember, there was a test that was given, and they had to go down to the water and drink. And God narrowed down the number of soldiers that Gideon would take into battle. Remember the number of soldiers that Gideon brought into battle with him? 300. We all so glad everyone remembers their Sunday school stories, because this is why we need it. There were 300 men that went with Gideon against the army of the Midianites. And a lot of times we think of this story, we need to understand Gideon didn't defeat the Midianites. God defeated the Midianites. God used Gideon and 300 men, and in one night, the Midianites were defeated. And Israel was free from their oppression. And God is saying, this is going to be just like that. One day, God is going to break the yoke, break the staff, break the rod. One day, God will deliver his people. And they will be free from their oppression. There will be deliverance from their enemies. And verse 5 describes that not only is there defeat, but this defeat is final and complete. The picture is they're going to take all the implements of war. They're going to take all of the garments of soldiers. They're going to take these things and they're going to burn them as fuel for fire. The picture is there's no more war. Typically, you would take those things and you would use them, right? You would take from those that you've defeated and use those things for further battle. The idea here is battle's done. There's peace. There's peace. God is going to deliver his people. God is going to bring peace. We look at this passage and see that God has great things in store for his people. And we know now, looking at this passage from a New Testament perspective, that Jesus fulfilled these things. That Jesus delivered his people from oppression, but not in the way they thought. He delivered from oppression to sin. He delivers from slavery to sin. And we also know that the victory is complete. We know that we no longer have to fear death. We no longer have to fear oppression. We have a hope. And just as these verses were speaking of a coming Messiah who would completely transform Israel, who would take their despair, who would take their gloom, who would take their oppression and turn everything upside down and bring joy and peace and hope. This is why we celebrate Christmas. Because Jesus came to this world as a light. Jesus came to this world to bring joy. And Jesus came into this world to bring deliverance to those who place their faith in him. For those who trust his work on the cross, we experience all of these things. Now, in some ways, I feel like The passage could end right here and it would be great. But the passage goes on. And next week, we're going to see a description of who this Messiah is. And we will, once again, I hope, be encouraged and strengthened, knowing what God has done for us when we understand who Jesus is and why we celebrate this time of year. A great light has come. And my prayer is a great light has come in your life. My prayer is that you've trusted and believed and placed your hope in that great light. Because I believe these promises can be true in our lives today. I think there will be a time when ultimately these things will be completely fulfilled in our lives, completely fulfilled through Jesus, but we experience part of that in our lives when we trust in Him. Let's pray together. Lord, I thank you so much for your word. I thank you so much for your promises. I thank you that as we look back, the words of hope you gave to your people, you told them that I will turn your gloom to joy. I will turn your anguish into peace. I will do something that will change everything. And Lord, we thank you so much that you fulfilled those words, that you sent your Son, and that we can have the hope that these promises give us. We pray this in your name. Amen.